You're watching a special Better Angels sit down with John Wood Jr. and my partner Ciaran O'Connor. Ciaran, what's going on, brother?
John, it's good to be here with you. It's been a long time coming.
I know it's been a long time coming, but we've gotten to do some pretty cool things together, working side by side in Better Angels and getting the Better Angels media up and running. But this is cool because this is going to be our first on-camera conversation, and we've had a few good ones behind the scenes, so now we get to chop it up a little bit for the world to see. So I'm stoked about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great to be able to, sort of take the Better Angels mission and activities into the media space,
Right.
And start to take on, the issue of polarization generally, but also issues of the day, and kind of explore this new way of talking politics that can be a little more constructive in this, toxic political climate we're living in these days.
Yeah, definitely. So, a lot of the people watching us, at least initially, I think are going to be familiar with the general mission of Better Angels and so forth. And of course, Better Angels is an organization founded by David Blankenhorn, which you could say sort of specializes in putting on these workshops where we go into local communities, bringing together Democrats and Republicans from across the aisle, and bring them into a space to where they can have an honest conversation, not a debate about politics or policy per se, but an honest dialogue about their own experiences, their own feelings, how it is they feel they are perhaps misunderstood by the other side of the aisle, how they feel that their own side can change, and then at the end of it, sort of allowing them the opportunity to speak directly to each other in a constructive and understanding sort of way. And, that's been a very powerful and positive thing for Americans really across various parts of the country who've had the opportunity to participate in this program. But with Better Angels Media, like you said, we're trying to sort of give ourselves the opportunity to broadcast this new way of doing politics.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's, like you said, Better Angels really got started with this workshop model.
Pioneered by Professor Bill Doherty.
Bill Doherty at the University of Minnesota. The first workshop was, I think, 3 weeks after the election in Southwest Ohio, and we were basically trying to see whether we could bring together 8 folks who voted for Trump, 8 folks who voted for Clinton, after an especially divisive, rancorous campaign season, and see could we bring them together to express themselves, better understand the other side without going at each other's throats off the bat.
Right.
So Bill designed a series of exercises rooted in family therapy, rooted in the practice of helping people clarify their disagreements, reduce the tendency to demonize right off the bat, and start to illuminate some of those shared values that get lost when we live, in our respective echo chambers, and start to see the other side as some sort of alien other.
Right.
So it's really about bringing people together in person, which we did through the workshops, and then the first one was really successful. We took the approach around the country, ended up going to about 10 states in 2017, doing about 40 workshops. And heading into 2018, we're certainly continuing to build out the organizing infrastructure. As you said, that's really, in a lot of ways, the heart of Better Angels is that person-to-person connection. It's the bread and butter of what we do.
Right.
But the other piece of it is starting to make a public argument, starting to reach folks who are shaping opinion in politics, in culture, in academia, and start to bring people together to show this new way of talking politics that, like I said, can be constructive as opposed to destructive, which is a lot of times what we see when we turn into cable news.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and part of what's exciting about that is that on every level, really, whether you're talking about the sort of grassroots organizing side of Better Angels, which has been the main thrust, I think, of our organizational focus so far, or the expanding sort of media component and this public argument piece of the Better Angels organization, which is now growing in the context of Better Angels Media. You have all sorts of places where people can plug in and get involved. So it's not something to where with Better Angels you have this small group of individuals who are just kind of having an internal conversation and doing things, on their own that other people are just supposed to watch and applaud from the outside. I mean, we need organizers. We need people to get interested who want to put together workshops in their hometown, to moderate workshops, locally. and or people who are interested in writing articles, hosting podcasts, so on and so forth. So this is a ship that we're building sort of as it's sailing, right? But we've already done so many remarkable things, and that's one of the amazing things about it that shows so much promise. I mean, you talked about the workshops that we've had across the country. I mean, the media coverage has been great, especially given how new our group is, from CNN to the New York Times to the Washington Post and the Washington Times, Al Jazeera, NPR. I mean, we've gotten
even some foreign press, actually.
Yeah,
we were recently in the German press, which was interesting.
Oh,
They were writing a big
Right.
piece about the political divide in America and profiled Better Angels.
Yeah.
But to your point, I think the key is that Better Angels Media is really a network.
Right.
It's a network and a community of people of goodwill on both sides who are interested in engaging each other and the issues in good faith and doing so in a manner that's respectful, empathetic, and humble.
Right.
Because I think in today's day and age, there's a fear on both sides that somehow listening to the other perspective with an open mind is somehow akin to surrendering your own perspective.
Right.
Which is really a dangerous idea. The American democracy is predicated on listening to the other side, engaging with ideas that you don't agree with, and not necessarily arriving at the middle. It's not always true that the right answer to move forward is exactly in the middle between one position and another.
Sure.
But it's about being honest with the other person and actually determining what their position is, because then you can sort of, like I said, clarify where do you actually disagree and where is that common ground. Because if you have two people who disagree on 90% of things, but they start to build an initial level of trust, and they start to sort of illuminate, okay, well, where is that 90% and where's the 10% of things we agree on? That's when you can actually start to see some progress and people working together. And that's what we've seen with some of the workshops which have led to Better Angels Alliances, where it's folks who have participated in the workshop and want to keep working together on this cross-partisan basis and continuing to meet regularly in their community and sort of drive our message and also try to potentially take up some issues of common concern.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And I think that part of what has to be a hallmark of a more productive kind of political conversation is the ability to be able to understand the point of view of the other person in a way that reflects the way they actually look at themselves, as opposed to whatever the sort of distorted...
The caricature.
Yeah, right, as opposed to a caricature, exactly. Because I think that that's what we have today. We have people caricaturing one another across, both lines of this divide. And, that's been a pretty profitable media model, I mean, whether you're talking about Fox or MSNBC or what, I mean, maybe one outlet is a little better or a little worse than the other, but it's just to say that as a broader culture, part of what perpetuates, I think, this sort of divisiveness in society is the fact that, it's empowering, the media model the way it's evolved up until this point, to say that, if we can cut these groups of Americans up in such a way to where we can sort of radicalize one against the other, then, well, that does no good for political progress or social harmony in the United States, but it's really good for ratings here, ratings there, So, part of what we want to do is to kind of push back against that a little bit and to say, look, obviously we've got to make content that's entertaining. We've got to make content that our community and viewers are, inspired by and stimulated by and so forth, But I think that, what you and I are trying to build and what Better Angels is trying to build is sort of a vision of how things could be to where, and keeping in mind the fact that, you're a registered Democrat, I'm a registered Republican. I mean, there are probably a number of things where, we have somewhat different perspectives on and so forth, right? But what you and I think, have discovered, and it wasn't through any great effort because you're a really cool dude, and it hasn't been too hard for me to get along with you really, and hopefully the same thing goes the other way. But I feel like we try to talk on sort of on a human wavelength, right? And to sort of contextualize the politics after establishing the fact that, like, whether we're totally in alignment on taxes or spending or healthcare or whatever the case may be, like we're both going for the same things ultimately, and that the problem in our politics, in our media environment right now, isn't that people have differences of opinions. It's that these differences of opinions are used as excuses for us to engage in a sort of tribal warfare. So that's the kind of divide that I see that I want to push back against. I don't care whether you're right or you're left. The question for me is, are you trying to actually understand what people are saying on the other side of the aisle? Are you trying to actually empathize with their experience, or are you not? Because if you're not, I really don't care if you agree with me on taxes or healthcare exactly. Mm-hmm. You're a part of the problem, and if you can't come along to the idea that says that maybe it's worth it for me to be a little bit humble and to try and understand where my ideological opposites are coming from, then you're not going to be, there's nothing you can do to really create a productive atmosphere of conversation, So if viewers start saying, you know what, we've had enough of the media status quo in that way. Like, maybe I like Sean Hannity, or I like Lawrence O'Donnell, or I agree with what they say on this, that, or the other, But let's recognize the fact that they're not making it easier for us to get along with each other as Americans. They're making it harder, And I've got nothing personal against those two guys, because I think they have honest points of view that come from their own experience. But, we've got to be able to kind of like get past those superficial differences a little bit, just to the extent to where it makes it easier for us to say, okay, there's a better way for us to have conversations. And I think that that's got to begin by us really kind of getting what the background history is of these different sides of the aisle. And so, to that end, I was part of what I'd like to know a little bit more about with respect to yourself personally is, as a person who, liberal Democrat, is that fair to say? Or do you prefer the term progressive, you say, or does it matter?
Either one, I think labels are not always super helpful, but I think definitely on the left-right binary, I would tend toward the former.
But you worked for the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016,
yes.
Pretty high level, right? And you worked for Barack Obama's campaign as a communications staffer in 2012, if I'm getting the resume right.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you've got a certain pedigree in Democratic politics and so forth. How did you come to the sort of posture where you're at now, where you're still committed to the views that you've had, I think, by and large, but you're trying to kind of expand this conversation? When did this revelation come?
Well, it's been sort of a process. I think it sort of touches on what you just said, and it's a really important point about Better Angels, is that to participate in our community and to be open to engaging with the other side does not really require you to abandon your own partisan views. Right. We have folks who have become leaders in our organization who hold strong ideological views. Yeah. You might be opposed to President Trump with every bone in your body, or you might be, a hardcore Tea Party activist, or you might honestly find Sean Hannity extremely objectionable. But that doesn't mean that you are just going to retreat into your own tribe and continue to promote this climate on both sides that is clearly tearing the country apart in a lot of ways. And I think from being out on the road, you don't have to convince anyone that this is a problem on both sides, and it's about how do we get to not a magic bullet solution, but how do we start moving forward and talking to one another once again. So in terms of my own personal story, the reason I got into politics originally was Barack Obama. Right. After 8 years of George W. Bush, who I felt like in a lot of ways didn't represent me or my friends or my community in New York City, I was very opposed to the war in Iraq. Barack Obama, in a lot of ways, this sounds kind of cliche, he was running on hope and change, but it really was inspiring. And it really felt like in some ways we were turning a page and entering a new chapter. Right. In some ways, in retrospect, maybe that was a little bit naive. Just in terms of the polarization, which obviously continued to increase over the course of his presidency.
But it helped inspire you, though.
Oh, absolutely. I remember in 2008, I worked as a volunteer. I was actually still in high school at the time. But I remember the feeling on election night being so, A, electrifying, but B, really inspiring in a sort of, substantive and pure way. And I think, regardless of what you think about President Obama's politics, I think most people would admit that he's a man of integrity, a man of a high ethical standard who was sort of a good example of what a leader can be, even if you don't agree with the direction he was leading the country or how he felt on specific issues. So that was something that always resonated.
You can always find a few people who
oh, of course. I think more than a few people who will say more than a few things about former President Obama.
Which is fine, because we want everybody in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I hear 100% where you're coming from.
So, I was always a big supporter of President Obama. I think obviously there were things that we didn't always completely see eye to eye on, and of course he made mistakes and had flaws, but overall, I felt like I was a supporter and I wanted to help further his agenda, and I felt like he was leading the country generally in the right direction from my own values and point of view. So in 2012, I got involved in the campaign as an intern, ended up taking a semester off of school to work through the election as a staffer. And, it was an extraordinary first job helping Barack Obama get reelected. I think in some ways it kind of spoiled me because that was sort of the zenith of my political campaign experience at 21.
You peaked too early.
Yeah, in some ways it's been downhill from there. But no, that opened up a lot of doors for me. After school, I worked in doing some political consulting work and then joined the Clinton campaign, which was also a really historic and rewarding experience, although obviously political campaigns are very much colored by the result. So I've known, the thrills of victory and the anguish of defeat very personally. But after the Clinton campaign, it was a devastating defeat, obviously, for people who supported Secretary Clinton and those who worked for her, not least because it was so shocking and because people felt like President Trump sort of represented an extraordinary threat in some ways, not just to political values, but to core institutions in a way that a traditional Republican...
In a way that John Kasich or Marco Rubio or...
Precisely, and I think the fact that the historic nature of Secretary Clinton's campaign as potentially the first woman to be president, following Barack Obama, who was the first black man to be president, for her to be defeated by somebody who had arguably trafficked in racism and misogyny was very painful to people personally, and continues to be painful. And so I felt that too. I actually bounced from America for 2 months and went to Asia, which I was very lucky to be able to do. But when I got back to the United States, part of me wanted to, join the opposition or the
resistance.
La résistance. Yeah. But part of me felt like the resistance was going to be well staffed. I was confident that there was no shortage of opposition and people working to fight back against President Trump and to especially try to advocate for and protect vulnerable populations that they felt like might be under threat from the administration. But at the same time, I recognize that this phenomenon of polarization, and I think Trump was not really a direct cause of polarization, but rather a symptom, sort of a crystallization.
It's so hard to imagine Trump coming about if we hadn't already been bitterly divided, right?
Absolutely. He really took advantage of it in many ways, and I think continues to perpetuate it, although obviously abetted by other forces on both sides. But so long story short, I recognized that this polarization was a problem, and I thought it was one that was not really being addressed, and like I said, was recognized by people of good faith on both sides as a problem, but was not really receiving that much attention. And some of the groups that were trying to deal with it were sort of doing it in a very centrist way, which is something, as I said, that I was not particularly interested in sort of fetishizing centrism.
Trying to get everybody to be a moderator.
Yeah, exactly. And so I basically found out about Better Angels because I got introduced to David Blankenhorn in New York City, and we started talking, and I really liked that Better Angels was really a grassroots thing. This was not a bunch of moderate, bipartisan former representatives of Congress who were convening summits to unveil their newest milquetoast bipartisan compromise, right? You know, this was really folks on the ground, you know, coming together in a really difficult time, and the idea of really trying to summon your better angels. Like, we all have this sort of better self that we can be, and I think this is one that you embody more than almost anyone I've ever met, which is part of the reason I'm attracted to working with you.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. So I think that's something that really appealed to me, and I mean, I was also frankly unemployed, so you know, the opportunity
helps open one's mind a little.
Yeah, exactly, and it was just sort of cool to do something different. And the fact that I was born in New York City. I went to a relatively liberal university. I worked on democratic politics. I had been sort of ensconced within this progressive bubble in a lot of ways. So I kind of wanted to challenge myself. And Better Angels, I've had the opportunity of getting to know and learn from, you know, conservatives who I've been really impressed by in a lot of ways. Like, not necessarily my views have changed, although in some ways they've deepened and broadened. But just sort of having a newfound respect for other points of view.
People like David Lapp and April Lawson and all sorts of people I imagine you've had a chance to, you know, really dive deep with, who come from a more conservative kind of vantage point. You know, well, you know what's interesting is that your story and mine sort of start off in a somewhat similar way in terms of, you know, how we kind of kick things off in politics. Now, for me, well, you know, if I go all the way back, so it's important for me to mention. Excuse me. I come from a you know, from a biracial, really a multicultural sort of family background. And later on in life, some people know I wound up running for Congress, being a nominee for Congress out of Los Angeles. And I had this opening line that I would that I would give to audiences, whether they were like, you know, black Democratic audiences in inner city LA or white conservative audiences in the South Bay portion of LA County. I would mention the fact that when asked why am I qualified to, you know, to represent in Congress a district as diverse as the one I was running for, that had these, you know, different groups, I would say, well, you know, I talk about my upbringing, and I'd mention the fact that my mother was a liberal black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles, and my father was a conservative white Republican from Tennessee, and that I grew up explaining my father to my mother and my mother to my father. And so, you know, if you want to know why I feel like I can represent a lot of you, it's pretty much that. Now, it's, you know, that was always a little bit of a simplification because my dad was actually a Democrat up until relatively recently. But the reason I mention it is because he was always, you know, my mother was younger than my father, a little bit of a generational divide between them. Definitely kind of an ethnic and cultural divide between them. I grew up kind of seeing these two faces of the American experience just through knowing my parents and knowing their families and so forth. So, you know, on my father's side of the family, there was a great deal of wealth with my grandparents and so forth. My grandfather was very successful in the music business way back in the 1950s and 60s. My grandfather founded Dot Records, Pat Boone's record label, Lawrence Welk, and so forth. And before that, he started the first radio show to broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel music, basically black music, though he was a white man, to a national audience, and that was called the Randy's Record Shop and so forth. But Grandpa was a Kennedy Democrat, and so my father was a Democrat, but he kind of had a much more traditional view of sort of American politics. So he was always the traditionalist in our household, whereas my mother had a much more kind of new age kind of, you know, spiritual and religious kind of culture, and she had a, you know, a lot more kind of progressive sorts of sentiments. Neither one of them were super political, really. But they just came from very sort of different worlds and so forth. And so, you know, Dad ultimately did switch parties right around the time Barack Obama ran for office. And it wasn't really any mystery to see why. He had a very traditionalist and in many respects kind of conservative view of America. So, you know, I grew up watching a whole lot of John Wayne movies. I grew up, you know, kind of with a lot of 50s nostalgia, you might say, you know. And, you know, I was also grew up a great admirer of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s. I mean, he was always my preeminent hero in life, really, you know. And the way I've tried to communicate as an adult and in politics comes directly, in many respects, from the influence that he had on me as a young person growing up. But what wound up happening was that, like yourself, I was really disappointed by American politics after George W. Bush was reelected. So I definitely consider myself to be liberal all the way through high school, really, and even after. So I graduated high school in 2004. But after George W. Bush was reelected, and by the way, I was a kid who was going to anti-war rallies during the run up to the Iraq War, speaking at city council meetings, putting Al Gore bumper stickers on cars and so forth. I mean, I was pretty active as an activist at that time. But after George W. Bush got reelected, I said, the system doesn't work. Forget it. I'm out. Right. And then Barack Obama came along, and when he emerged, I looked at him and I thought, so this is the guy I've been waiting for. You know? And it was on a number of different levels. I mean, one obvious thing was that his background was kind of as similar to my background as any person who'd ever run for president, right? It wasn't just that he was biracial, but he had white conservative grandparents. He had a progressive mother, but he was he's half black, half white, all of that. I just saw a lot that I could relate to in him. I read his books, The Audacity of Hope, Dreams from My Father. He was this person who kind of had spent his youth and his coming of age experience kind of walking the tightrope of these two different kind of cultural experiences in America, and sort of finding himself in the context of the black community. I got it. All of it sort of spoke to me. But what came out of that, in terms of my appreciation for his views, was the fact that it seemed to me that the idea of hope and change wasn't so much about socializing America, which is kind of the way it was defined by some quarters on the right afterwards. But it seemed more to me like what he was saying was, let's get past sort of the partisanship in America and let's get to a post-racial kind of post-politically polarized kind of society.
There are no red states. There are no blue
exactly.
states.
Right, that famous speech at the Democratic National Convention. And to me, that was what Dr. King was trying to get at. Obviously, that was a different context, and King was trying to get beyond racial prejudice and so forth. But King was also not a political partisan. I mean, politically speaking, he was a little more liberal. But, truth be told, Dr. King actually said at one point that he said better not to be a slave to either party, but rather the conscience of both. And so that's how he described basically why he was an independent, or why he refused to outwardly identify with either Democrats or Republicans. So I love that transcendent vision that Obama had. But like yourself, as time went on, I sort of started to feel like maybe a little bit of my belief in that was somewhat naive. But I wound up going in a bit of a different direction, because what happened with me was I thought, so this was a little earlier, right? Because this is 2008 for me. You started working with his campaign in 2012. I worked as a canvasser for his campaign, so I was just a foot soldier. I didn't have a fancy job title like that, like you did, but my heart was in it, And after he was elected, what I thought to myself to do was I said, okay, well, now we've got to go. I was really looking forward to Camelot, right? It reminded me of the idea of John Kennedy's Camelot. What that was supposed to be, I was thinking that could be what Obama's presidency might actually turn into. And so I thought that to be a good foot soldier for that movement, I needed to really understand Republicans and really understand conservatives better than I had, so that I could more effectively, communicate with and articulate with people on the other side of the aisle.
Right.
So, I had always spent a little bit of time watching Fox News and so forth. And actually, me and my dad would watch Hannity and Combs regularly. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s.
R.I.P. Alan Combs.
Yeah, Alan Combs. He was a good guy, I think,
Yeah.
And, by the way, that's a little bright spot in terms of, the history of our partisan political media, because I think that Sean Hannity and Alan Combs, as divisive as Sean Hannity gets a lot of times, when Alan Combs passed, he really made it clear that he loved that guy. And I think that that's an important little Better Angels moment to highlight, since I've mentioned Hannity a couple of times. But, so, I went out of my way to start, really getting deep into conservative media and start reading things that I hadn't read before. So I read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. I read Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, I was also going through an interesting religious kind of transition in my life because I had kind of gone from thinking of myself as very much an agnostic to then sort of like, after studying like, classical philosophy and metaphysical, philosophy in the Greeks and so on and so forth, I came to thinking of myself as a person who kind of believed in a spiritual reality. Then I got into like the New Age movement and so forth. And then I met my wife, who's very traditional, comes from a very traditional African American Protestant background. And for the first time in my life, I started reading the Bible very thoroughly. And after immersing myself in it and really getting into the church and so forth, I wound up kind of coming to a point to where I thought, I can see how this from my own spiritual vantage point, how Christian faith actually can ring true, And without, going into, any more detail about that, I kind of found myself experiencing a bit of a religious conversion that kind of recontextualized a lot of the sort of social arguments and so forth. So what wound up happening was a couple of things. On the one hand, I wound up thinking, okay, I'm starting to feel myself to be a little bit more socially and religiously conservative than I did before. In reading The Wealth of Nations and in reading Atlas Shrugged and all that, even though I didn't, buy every argument of like, every libertarian position, I started to realize that, there is a lot to be said about capitalism and the free market that's positive. Because I had a very negative view of it up until then. And in particular with respect to the African American community, I observed the fact that, we had the Great Society program in the 60s and we've had all this social spending, but I was living in South LA and in Watts and places like that, and it just seemed like there hadn't been a lot of progress made, So all of these things kind of nudged me towards thinking like, John, you might be a little more conservative than you realized, prior to this moment. And, I continued to very much like Barack Obama, but it felt as if the kind of like the mission of bringing Americans together was not really proceeding the way I had hoped it would. So, at a certain point, I thought, I want to bring a message to my own community, a message that says that, on the one hand, we still want to fight for a post-partisan, post-racial society, but on the other hand, we ought to really be considering conservative points of views. And so I wound up running for Congress as a Republican in South Central LA against Congresswoman Maxine Waters. So this is back in 2014 or so. And it gave me the opportunity to, in some cases, be treated like a black Republican by, folks who, and sort of realize that, like, hey, black conservatives have it kind of rough sometimes, because there's in the black community, there's a certain polarization, and black people are overwhelmingly Democratic, typically. But, there's black people historically, were Republican up until a certain point in time coming out of the Civil Rights Movement. And there's still a pocket of black conservatives, in that community. And so, I tried to be a bridge between those two sides in the black community. I tried to be a bridge between black and white in the district. And I tried to be a bridge between Republican and Democrat in general, because, I still sympathize with so much of what people were saying on the left. But I also came to really understand and personally resonate with a lot of the values and even policy ideas that I observed on the right, And so that's the experience that brought me around to, when my friend, brilliant researcher and writer, our mutual friend, Luke Phillips, when he, brought Better Angels to my attention, that's what made me look at that and say, okay, this is the unique organizing opportunity that we have to really make a difference and change this conversation. And that's how I wound up getting stuck with you, which is something for which an opportunity for which I'm very grateful. I'd like to mention. So yeah, man, that's pretty much, that's how we got here. What gives you hope in terms of where the country is in this moment? Because a lot of people are very pessimistic, and I think that you might have people watching, just in our last few minutes here, you might have people watching this video who think, okay, well, you guys are well-intentioned or whatever, but let's be honest. People are never going to get over their partisan hang-ups, or one side is right, one side is wrong. What gives you hope in this moment in American history where people are so divided that this can actually be a turning point in spite of all of the ugliness we see in front of us?
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that the forces driving polarization are very strong and in some ways are continuing to accelerate. But at the same time, I think our society has become so dynamic and quickly changing that it's very difficult to predict the future. And in some ways, I think what we're starting to see now is a reckoning of sorts with polarization. Or at least that's what I'm hopeful of. I think, as I said, I think the Trump administration in particular has begun to crystallize and really lay bare some of these divisions. So some of the stuff that was sort of, burbling beneath the surface during President Obama's term is now sort of out in the open. And even if people don't agree on why it is or who's to blame for it, they can see it and they can acknowledge it on both sides. So I think that sort of provides, interestingly enough, sort of a starting point, right? Like we both recognize now this is a problem. And we probably both agree that we need to do things to make it better because we can see the ways that it's hurting our country, that it's hurting our community, that it's dividing colleagues and family members, right? So I think that provides an initial common acknowledgement. And the other thing that gives me hope is just the common humanity that you see when you bring people together in person. So that's been one of the really exciting things about Better Angels and an exciting prospect if we can really scale our work, which is putting in place the structure and environments and settings and processes that enable this productive in-person engagement to happen that actually allows people to start to rebuild a little bit of trust. I think it's a lot harder to do that online, and I think that's one thing we're tackling with Better Angels Media. But really, the in-person sort of awakenings that you see after people participate in the workshop, and it's not that suddenly they've really moderated their view or changed their mind or come around to an opposing position, but they've really changed their mind about how they think about each other. So I think that's a really important first step. And again, I mean, after working on the Clinton campaign, I've taken myself out of the prediction game. I think things are so dynamic and so fluid that things can turn really quickly. And I'm hopeful, as I said, that things have become so raw that we could see a turning point, hopefully in the next couple of years, as this administration continues to do its thing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'll say just as we wrap it up here, I mentioned my family and I mentioned my dad. I'm a Republican. And I voted for Mitt Romney in 2012. I didn't vote for Donald Trump in 2016. Even if I agreed with Trump on this individual issue or that individual issue, I'm a person who wants to see people come together. And it was just, for various reasons, some of which you alluded to, it was hard for me to get behind that campaign. But my father is as big a Trump supporter as you'll ever meet. And he's also, quite literally, the least racist person I've ever met. He's my father, so by definition, I don't think...
Is he less racist than Trump? Because Trump is also
well, that's true.
Trump
is the least racist person by his own definition, of course.
Right.
But, it's just to say that you can find goodness wherever you look on the political electorate. We may not always get it right in terms of our views on policy. We may wind up... speaking in ways that don't always reflect the best of us, the best of what we have on the inside. But that's why we want to bring that out and bring that forward in one another, because there's reason for us to love one another. And, as Dr. King was so gifted at making clear, love is a powerful and transcendent social value. And I think that if we can reintroduce that, into the political conversation, then we can get over the hump. So, for those of us who are watching here today, I think we got to thank folks for supporting Better Angels. And I think what I'd like to ask people to do is, if you're moved by this conversation, if you think that Better Angels is possibly an opportunity for yourself to get involved in politics in a unique way, there are a number of things you can do. You can become a member of Better Angels. They can join us at the website. You can sign up to be an organizer, to put on a workshop in your hometown. You can get in touch with us at Better Angels Media if you're interested in writing articles, possibly even hosting a podcast or show of your own. We're looking to expand our repertoire, our roster, so to speak. Am I missing anything? What else is a good thing to tell people to do?
Another thing that we're starting to introduce is trainings for people who want to become moderators. As I mentioned, the structure of the workshops is really important. And Bill Doherty, who's the family therapist who designed these workshops, has designed a training module, which is going to be online. So you can actually apply to get trained as a moderator and then work with organizers in your community to help pull off these workshops.
There you go. So. Absolutely. And as always, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And keep up with us. You're watching Better Angels Media.